Hello, my name is Francis Coliato, your Executive Director at Visual Communications. In our work to create spaces for expression, engagement, and empowerment, VC and our partners proudly present the Asian Pacific Virtual Showcase. It is our hope that this showcase of our stories will be a start for audiences to rediscover our humanity. In solidarity with our partners, our collective movements not only exhibit actions towards diversity, equity, and inclusion, but our anti-racist work to uplift storytellers who use the power of media to dismantle supremacist structures. Thank you for joining us today as we continue to move forward in uplifting and connecting our communities. Welcome to the Asian Pacific Virtual Showcase.
My name is Akiemi Glenn. I am wearing a blue top and sitting in my office, my home office, with some photos on the wall behind me. I'm calling in from occupied Hawaii on the island of Oahu. The valley is called Pōpolo Valley. And I also want to take this time to acknowledge, as we're acknowledging the land that we're on, also to acknowledge the ancestors known and unknown that we come from. And especially want to acknowledge the ancestors of folks who are in this conversation today, whose lives and struggles have made it possible for us to be here talking to each other. I am the executive director of the Pōpolo project based here in Honolulu, and I'm excited to hear more from our other panelists. I'll pass it to Ethan.
Thanks, Akiemi. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I'm wearing a light chambray colored button-up shirt, curly hair against a white background. I'm calling from the Manoa Valley of Oahu in the occupied Hawaiian Kingdom, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Hawaiʻi at Manoa and a collaborator with Pahana Sessions. I'd like to pass this off to Johnathan.
Thank you, Ethan. My name is Johnathan Gibbs. I am currently sitting in my room in a navy blue t-shirt in front of a black backdrop, sitting in a black chair. I am calling into this from Brooklyn, New York, land of the Canarsie Lenape people.
Thank you both. I want to welcome you to this conversation this afternoon. We are in the midst or towards the end of Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and we have this really interesting opportunity to continue this conversation that I know all of us have been a part of for the last several weeks and years of our lives and our work, really thinking about the opportunities to explore what solidarity looks like, especially around visual media. And I'm really excited to spend some time with you two over the next few minutes, getting to know your work and learning more about what you do and why you do what you do. I'd like to start with asking both of you, we just had our land acknowledgements and our names shared, but I'd love to hear from each of you kind of what you do. I know that you're in different parts of the world right now, in Brooklyn and in Hawaii. Would be curious to hear about what kinds of work, especially the media work that you folks are engaged in right now. I'd like to start with Johnathan. Could you tell us a little bit about where you are, how the work that you do impacts your life?
Sure. Thank you for the question. The work that I do is mainly at the intersection of Black and Asian identity. It started 13 years ago on a platform called YouTube. Before it was owned by Google. It was almost a wild, wild west of media at the time, or a new emerging branch of media that would later flourish into what it is now in 2021 and what it has grown throughout the 2010s and that whole subculture of media. At the same time, I used social media platforms like Facebook, which have also grown in the past 10 to 15 now years, I think, to create spaces for Black and Asian mixed people so that we could come together and discuss identity, experience, share and compare, contrast lived experiences, and be there for one another, just to let one another know that we see and acknowledge each other. Most recently, especially in the wake of the year that was 2020, I created a Facebook group called the Black and Asian Alliance Network, which has evolved into more than just a group. We have multiple media teams working on creating and crafting narratives, of course, based on true stories that show the world that Black and Asian people can unite, express solidarity, alliance, and move forward together, much like how we have historically. So we've got a podcast in the works. We've produced one episode. We have a video team, all of this volunteer, by the way. And then, of course, a Facebook group where the discussion happens. So yeah, that's about it for my work for now. And I look forward to doing even more for the cause.
That's great. Ethan, could you share a little bit about your work?
Sure thing. I also want to just give a shout out to Johnathan, because I think, Johnathan, you provided one of the first spaces online for a lot of Black and Asian mixed folks to come together. And so I've always been appreciative of the work that you do, and, especially over a decade running. And, not only myself, but I think, my students are also very appreciative of the things that you do. As for myself, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Hawaiʻi, where a lot of my work, revolves around questions of Black Asian relations, race, gender, and also this idea of nationhood and militarism. Currently working on a book project currently titled Deploying Blackness, which is asking the question essentially of what happens when BIPOC communities buy into white supremacist and support white supremacy through the institutions that they're a part of. And so a lot of my analysis is looking at the experiences of Black soldiers stationed abroad in Okinawa and trying to understand what happens when they are stationed abroad. How do ideas of race, gender, nationality, and also alignment with different local and indigenous communities also get impacted by military service and an alignment with the military, these ideas of being part of an occupation force. And so in one part, that's what I do. On the more creative side, I'm also part of the collective known as Paulana Sessions. We're a group of 3 professors that, curtail and curate place-based musical experiences while also looking at the relationship between geography, aesthetic, ideology, culture, and identity. But what we really try to do is bridge the gap between the artist and the audience as much as possible, but also not only to talk about music, but to go beyond the music and also try to understand what inspires many of those artists to follow through with that kind of work.
Thank you for that, both of you. You're both doing really important and expansive work, and I can't wait to see what more you're able to offer to our community. Something that both of you kind of touched on in your work and describing and situating the work that you do is around identity, and especially around the identities of mixed race Black and Asian folks, who often are not necessarily the faces of Black community or Asian community in a lot of the discourses that we're subject to. And certainly in the last several months, there have been a lot of calls and conversations about solidarity across communities. But a lot of those discourses presume that Black communities and Asian communities are distinct and different and discrete. And I think both of you are engaged in work that I think makes that a little bit troublesome, this idea that we're only thinking of these distinct and sometimes clashing communities. I wonder how you deal with these ideas of kind of the borders of community, both in kind of your personal situation, the way that you situate yourselves and your personal identities as mixed race folks, but also how you deploy that in the work that you're doing in the different kinds of media that you're engaged in.
Well, for me, very interestingly, I was born in the Bay Area and then of the United States, so California, West Coast. Then lived the first years of my life in San Diego, which was a lot of Mexican population and Filipino folks in my classrooms as a student, and then like very few Black and white people. Then I moved to the South, where it was very binary Black and white. Then now I live in New York, where it's just culturally diverse. So I've been around a lot of different kinds of neighborhoods. And I think that the work that we're doing when we're trying to bridge together these communities, it's difficult, and it's difficult for a reason, because there is this exclusivity for both communities. And within those pockets, or I should say within those large sects of each community, there are a lot of stereotypes and ideas about the other side. So I definitely view myself as in the minority, and I think I've navigated life with a lens that says, okay, well, this is how the world looks at me. And so I have to accept that. I have to do the work to educate people, and some are not going to be receptive to that. And I felt that a lot when people say, oh no, whatever your father is, that's what you are. Or whenever someone has straight up invalidated my identity and said, you're not Blasian, that's not a real thing. I have to accept that people are going to operate that way. And so my motto nowadays is that there are plenty of people that are going to hate on you or that are going to invalidate you. We know that they exist. The work is to find the people that agree with you so that you can hold hands and move forward together. I wonder what you feel about this, Ethan. I'm pretty sure that you've dealt with this. We've known each other over 10 years, but I don't think we've ever had like a conversation like this. So looking forward to what you have to say about it.
No, I'm also very intrigued. And I actually forgot that you were originally from the Bay Area, because for me, a lot of the family extends, or my current family is still in the Bay Area, and that's where I spent a lot of time after being abroad in Okinawa, because my dad was in the military, and before that, being in the Central Valley of California. And all three spaces, have very different and distinct contexts to not only who is there, but then also how mixed race and these sort of our sort of presence, is handled. Are people looking at us through a disdain, or are folks looking at us different just because we don't really fit neatly into any particular box and pocket? But what I will say in relation to that too is, regardless of the space that we're in, far too often I find that there's so much work that needs to be done. Whether it's thinking about and also going beyond just the idea that mixed race is always going to be able to bridge the gap, because, that's one, putting a lot of pressure on folks that, are within the margins, but then also a lot of the sort of politics that do exist between the different groups that are very much confounded by prejudices and these sort of histories of entanglements between different Asian communities, different Black communities. It's almost too neat because it still exists within this larger umbrella of white supremacy, and in the sense that we often see this as a conflict that's occurring between these two communities without also looking at what other strings are being pulled in order to create those conditions. And I think, part of the challenge with it is also educating folks to say, hey, are we stepping back? Are we zooming out to also see what else is going on? And not necessarily just between these communities, but also how are these communities being put into conflict with one another time and time again? And who is that actually serving? And then on the other side too, it then becomes a question of then saying, but with that in mind, how is that then feeding into the prejudices that communities have with one another? How do we also then address those through not just education, but whose responsibility does that become, right? And I think, far too often, as folks of color, we get called upon to do a lot of that free labor. But on the other end, if we don't do it, how do we want to see it? How do we want to see it shaped? And at what cost as well?
Yeah, I think really excellent points raised there. And I think one of the challenges of this conversation and the work that you folks are doing is exactly kind of those borders and boundaries that are reinforced by stereotypes and kind of canonical ideas of what a Black person is doing, what their politics are, what an Asian person is doing, what their politics are, what they look like, where they've come from, where they live, right? I'm really curious to hear from both of you, especially because you're both media makers. How do you really reckon with the reality of the visual representation of the communities that you're a part of, in particular, Blasian community, and also Black and Asian folks who are in dialogue with each other? Ethan, I know a little bit about your work in looking at relationships between military personnel in Okinawa, and Johnathan, the content creation that you've done for so long, I think really disrupts a lot of the narratives that mainstream media depictions have kind of provided us with. But I'm curious to hear from each of you how you play with or reckon with, what kind of trouble comes up when you try to think about visual representations of the communities.
I can go first because I have something like really on the top of my head. And to answer your question, the question that you asked before I launch into just a rant, I tackle it head on. Now I'm 13, 14 years into this this exploration of what it means to be Blasian. And for so long, you asked specifically about visual media and what it means to look whatever. Well, all my life, I've believed that I look Black. People have told me I'm Black. I'm proud of that Blackness. There's no reason to be ashamed of it. So I've lived life as a Black person. It was only after undergrad that I was like, wait, I'm erasing my mother and I need to honor the heritage that she has given me, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because I'm a mama's boy. So like, I'm gonna rep her. And what does that mean? That means me looking into my Filipino-ness. So when I started calling myself Blasian, when I started pushing the fact that I have the right to be in Asian conversations, then that was second level realization of what it means to be, quote, Asian. Fast forward to, what was it, 2017? Then we see in the media, I think it was 2017, fact check me, Crazy Rich Asians came out. And lots of people were happy. Oh, Asian representation in the media, finally, yes. First time since whenever the last one was, Joy Luck Club, all Asian, but then there was other movies. But then there was the understandable pushback from Southeast Asians and Brown Asians and South Asians. And that allowed me as a biracial mixed Asian to be like, hey, this is also something that I can care about. Like the things that these folks over here are talking about took me to what I call level 3 understanding now when we talk about Asian communities. Because one of the things that we have to do when we are understanding not just the dialogue between Black and Asian communities is to understand that within both, and I think that someone just said it a few minutes ago, neither community is a single community. There are plenty of different sects of the Black community, and I think that at this point, I don't even want to say the Asian community because folks call Japanese people Japanese. They call Korean people Korean. So if you're mixed Black and Asian, then I need to know, like, are you Black Filipino? Are you Black Japanese? Are you Black Chinese? Like, because what does it serve when we kind of just wash over it and just say Asian? So getting back on track, developments within visual media, especially in cinematic storytelling, with specific regard to how Crazy Rich Asians elevated, quote, Asians, has made me and many others recognize that we still have a long way to go, but now I get to be a part of that conversation more easily than before, when Asian was just East Asian, basically, in visual media.
Appreciate that for your response, Johnathan, because I think there's, you're also getting to this question of then saying and pushing back against folks who always force us to choose. Do you have to be either Black? Do you have to be Asian? And even then, it's Black can mean so many different things, especially thinking about what Black looks like in the South versus in New York City, or even which borough of New York City versus West Coast versus even here, in Oahu. And I think, there's something to be said about this idea of, folks trying to lump consciously many different mixed folk into being one or the other, or this sort of idea that mixed race really gets conflated into one particular identity. The other thing too is also, I think, with the development of more content creators that are mixed, or even folks who are behind the camera that are mixed, I think there's also a way that we can play with and critique how we're being represented. And I remember this when thinking about the various sort of representations of, for example, like Blasian folks in the media. How often do we think about who is representing us, and does that really tell our story? And I think a lot of the kind of things that we do with Paul sessions is we really try to force some of that conversation to come out, not only in the way that we're crafting the videos, but then also in the sort of dialogue that's occurring between artists and us, or even artists and camera. And I think, that also goes to show in many ways the development of what happens when people are then owning that sort of content creation. What happens when they have more of a say in who and how they're being represented, but even more so forcing the question to then say, you have to reckon with all sides of me, not necessarily just the one that you're pigeonholing me, myself, and I into.
Well, I want to respond to your response, because what you brought up for me was that when you brought up the point of like who is representing us, that like we are of the age to remember when Tiger Woods was the only person that we as Blasian males could identify with, and we don't even like at that time we didn't know, because he told Oprah, like, I'm Cablinasian. So like, what Asian? You're like Black, and then I guess some kind of Caucasian. And then of course he got dragged for that by the Black community. And now we're in 2021, and it's like, you get to claim Naomi Osaka, I get to claim her. But you know, it's like, now we have these very specific like people where it's just not Black and then Asian, and we have to look up to them as our as someone who represents us in the media. Tiger Woods least of all, because he's had some pretty troubling stuff happen, and like, I still ride with him, but like, and I understand that people have life, but like, you know, thank God he's not even more problematic. Anyway, it's just, you got to reckon with that, I guess.
Yeah, you had to bring up Tiger Woods because I feel like throughout all of middle school, that was the one person I was always compared to, especially if you're wearing a Nike polo shirt,
Oh my God.
whatever else
And a
it
hat.
is, right? That's it. That's all it takes. I mean, you know, usually these days it's the Pharrell sort of likening, but you know, especially after the whole Skip Gates doc, I think some of that put his blasianness out of question.
I think, you know, this question of representation is a really interesting one, especially for this conversation today. We're here in, you know, what is called AAPI Heritage Month, not uncontroversially. I'm sure all of us have been following some of the discussions around, you know, exactly what you just talked about, Johnathan, like putting all these communities together. Especially when we think about the role and the prominence or lack of visibility for Pacific Islanders often in this time, even though it's kind of a large category for US Census purposes, right? And I wonder if you folks have thoughts on the value of these kinds of observances. Heritage months, like, you know, we're in May. There was Black History Month in February, which, you know, some people don't know the origin of that from G. Carter Woodson was his time in the Philippines, and thinking about Filipino history being taught to kids there in the early 20th century, and then him returning to the US and thinking, well, you know, if Filipino kids need to know their history to be able to situate themselves, so do Black kids, and starting Negro History Week. So there are already these kind of long-standing Black and Asian connections and learning across communities. And I just wonder what you folks think about kind of the role of observances like, you know, a month on the calendar in terms of us getting representation for our communities, but also having a dedicated time and space to kind of dig into some of these more thorny issues.
I feel like that was good for the time. We should have updated ours. We should have gotten the Android update or the latest download to say, okay, this just needs to be part of the curriculum. It's 2021. This happened how long ago that we kind of recognize, oh, well, we need to teach. At some point in the last however many years, it should have evolved into part of the basic curriculum, I think. I'm not against the idea of having a month at all. I love that it's there, but I really wish we could take that and like run with it even further to just acknowledge that, you know, this should just be information that we should all learn. And I'm speaking from the context of someone who has been a student in the United States. So the United States being what it is, and with the mix of people that it has, I really feel like by 2021, we shouldn't need to have months, because we should all be learning about every one of us.
Just to kind of extend that thought a little further, I'm almost wondering where the utility of having the month. I understand in so many ways why we have them, but I hope, and I think this is maybe my critique of it, similar to Johnathan, I hope it goes well beyond that month of learning. Should it be part of the basic curriculum? Absolutely. But I think there's reasons why it's not. And I think those reasons speak very loudly to what would happen in terms of how that could potentially build solidarity between different communities, especially if you start to think about how and why we all are here, you know, and in all the different sort of manifestations of whether it's immigration, migration, and more, or what kind of violence and atrocities have occurred in order to create America as we know. And I think in some ways, yes, the celebrations need to occur, and sure, you know, having these months to do it, you know, are great, but also going beyond those celebrations and also saying, well, what else is there? Why do we need to celebrate? But even more so, in some ways, why are we also celebrating a certain level of resiliency? How is this also a mark of not only our presence, but also, in many ways, the painful histories that have come before us from generations, communities, and families that have really tried to craft their sort of way, but also what work also needs to be done. And I think part of this is also just ensuring that having an AAPI month or API month or even a Black History Month goes beyond just tokenizing and saying, hey, we've done our part for these Black folks or for these Asian folks, and let's move on to June. It has to go beyond that in order for effective change to actually occur.
The effective change would be evolving from having the month to making it part of the curriculum to getting bank holidays, because then it's real, right? Then it's an acknowledgement. It's like we do what? Christmas, Easter, New Year's, Memorial Day, and the other one that I always confuse with Memorial Day in September, Labor Day. Okay, well, what about, everyone celebrating Lunar New Year and getting a week off or whatever, or everybody celebrating Juneteenth, and not just making it a thing where, oh yeah, it's that thing. Okay, yeah, and you can take off if you want to, because I know it's important to you. It should be important to us as a nation. And I think,
makes me wondering. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was thinking about that, especially because I know some companies are starting to celebrate, and provide time off for folks for Lunar New Year. I also wonder if it's the same for like Chuseok or, these sort of remembrances of the dead and those who have passed as well. Because when you embed that within the framework of the culture, and also it goes beyond just acknowledging, but also in many ways, there's a certain level of respect that also comes with it. To see that nationally, I think also gets us into some interesting debates too, including of, for example, why MLK didn't have a holiday in Hawaii until the late 80s, early 90s, because, some of the lawmakers were worried that we would have, too many holidays. And that I remember this being a quote in the class that I taught, but I think one of the quotes was, if Martin Luther King gets a holiday, Martin Luther King Jr. gets a holiday, then who's next? Gandhi, where does it end? And part of that too is the resistance, to these holidays, the resistance to the way that we celebrate these also speaks volumes to the status quo, what needs to be changed, but also who is being resistant to that change for what purposes as well.
And also, finally, who is being celebrated currently?
You can say that again.
All super relevant. And I think, that point you made, Ethan, about our history here in Hawaii around Martin Luther King, right? And even Juneteenth, it's been difficult because Hawaii has its own history that's very separate from North America, and especially around race and presence of Asian folks and Black folks here is just a very different history from other places. There's always that kind of that has for both of you folks. We're kind of in this current moment, the capital M moment, right? That we've been kind of just like tumbling around since 2020 started and pushed us into the pandemic and racial reckoning. We've seen unbelievable levels of violence directed at Black folks, at Asian folks, especially East Asian folks and elders. A lot of the conversations we've had, I'll say that I've observed in the last few months, have really kind of focused on that violence, which in some ways seems like an extension of the colonial violence that we've seen, going back to the very beginning of the time that we were just talking about with the induction of Negro History Week, because there was no space in the curriculum. And this was trying to kind of be a counter and a different context for people's experiences. Right. But even thinking about the fact that Woodson was in the Philippines because of the US occupation there. Right. And so these kind of moments of cross-pollination and fertilizing and possible solidarity are often brought out of very violent moments. And I think that we're in some right now. I'm curious what you folks are thinking about this kind of, I would say, relatively newfound attention. We saw the movement, the hashtag Stop Asian Hate kind of trending. We saw, just like we did last summer with Black Lives Matter, we saw lots of corporate interests saying that they were going to dedicate time and resources to having different depictions of Asian communities. I'm curious what you think about this kind of newfound attention to the communities that we're a part of, Black communities, Asian communities. Is there something useful in this moment that we're conversations? We just had this legislation passed and signed by the president looking at anti-Asian violence. just last week. But then there are lots of challenges, just as we were talking about, in terms of representation and what that actually means for people's lives. So I'm just curious what this might mean to each of you in the work that you're doing as media creators, as scholars, as activists. Do you see a value in the attention that's being directed to our communities right now? Do you see it as a place that we can leverage, a jumping off point for something better and more just for our communities? Or do you see it as something that comes with a lot of challenges?
I'm very cautious of performative allyship and performative action. And I was very much so all last year in 2020 when it was Black Lives Matter, despite it having existed since at least 2014. And when in 2019, the conversation surrounding Black Lives Matter was whether it was a terrorist organization or not, and that people really couldn't vibe with it. Until 2020, when George Floyd happens, then all of a sudden everybody jumped on the bandwagon. Now, the real shade here with Stop Asian Hate that I have come to realize in conversations in the Black and Asian Alliance Network is that a lot of Asians didn't know about the history and the things that we already knew about in terms of attacks. A lot of Asian American people, I should say, didn't act as if this is new. You know, a lot of us have known that Asian people in America have been bullied all their life. We know that, that are modern Asian American, like people that are alive today, that are our age, were bullied. Our elders grew up in a time when there was legislation against them. Their ancestors and our ancestors fought against Chinese, or had to endure Chinese exclusion and race riots and mass lynchings in Los Angeles. Like, that history is there. Japanese internment, just yellow peril. But a lot of people don't know that are alive today, that are our age. Like, this year has been some of them coming to this realization, and I ask myself, why? How in the world did you not know about these things? Well, our history is not in the curriculum, but also there is a problem that I don't tiptoe around. It's the model minority myth and how some people play into it and align with it. And so they've never had to worry about it. It's not everyone, but it is some people that I have discovered in my work. And we're very patient and we say, hey, did you know that this happened and this, that, and a lot of people are realizing it. But for me, it's being aware of ignorance that is just an unfortunate byproduct of many different things that have happened in this country that have caused people to have certain dispositions of, oh, I don't need to be involved with this, until it comes to your doorstep, as well as, you know, more insidious actions by governments and trying to erase or even demonize certain movements and histories that they perpetuated themselves against the people. It's a mixed bag of things, but it's surprising to me, and it is not surprising at the same time.
I think you're also, thank you, Jonathan. I think you're also highlighting so many of the challenges that come from folks who, in some ways, who have experienced this for years or even lifetimes, whose ancestors have had to endure more than just hate, and I think what becomes so instrumental about, this last year, and I would say last several years, even more so, is also just how many community folk are not necessarily with you. I mean, there's that line, skin folk and kinfolk, for a reason. And I think, what probably the 2020 has really helped highlight is who is really in alignment, who rocks with you in that particular way, what other communities do or don't, but even more so, the why behind it. I think that's been one of the most revealing things, being in this moment, is always figuring out who are your real friends, who are your real allies, who's going to actually roll with you, if things hit the fan and more, but also who is only there to show up for the picture and, for the gram or whatever it might be. I think that also comes back to, this idea of what happens not only to these movements, how do they fizzle out, but also how do you find ways to sustain it? Education becomes one of those particular venues, but then also, for some folks, confronting it head on, confronting folks that are, say, for example, in alignment with these larger institutions that support white supremacy, through a very colonial mimicry kind of manner, even if it's not benefiting them. Getting folks to also recognize why it's not benefiting them is it becomes, in some ways, I feel, a lifetime of work, whether it's folks that are our family, friends, and large community. And I'm speaking about this, thinking about the way that people are approaching Black Lives Matter here on the islands, but then even the comments that you'll see come up with some of the killings that occur, whether it's in Asian American communities or even African American communities, of they should have been following the law, they should have been doing this, and that. That's also, in many ways, always assuming that the institution is right, or that we have to mold ourselves into a very particular protocol in order to just survive. Whatever happened to our humanity? Whatever happened to recognizing that from the start? And what I find revealing, within this last year plus, however many years we want to go back, is just how quick people in many communities come to when it's disassociating people with that humanity. Through anti-Blackness, through alignments to, white supremacy, through the mono-minority myth, even if it doesn't benefit them in the long run. And so, similar to Johnathan, I'm cautious. I think there could be great things that can happen from this moment, but I also hope that those great things are sustainable and not necessarily just a quick little Band-Aid to put on a wound that actually needs to be, whatchamacallit? What is it? Y'all help me out. What is the process?
Stitches?
Thank you. There we go.
Yeah.
Instead of, putting Band-Aids
Real healing?
on, exactly, real healing, in targeting a root versus just putting like a multitude of small Band-Aids on something just to like allow it to heal, but continue to fester years and years down the road. Thank y'all for the help on the stitches. I could not get that word out.
Well, that means you're probably not having to sew up wounds too often. That's good news.
Or more like, when you have a parent that doesn't believe that you need stitches, I think we've all been there.
Listening to both of you folks talk about the last year and many more, thinking about performative allyship and this kind of, capital M moment that we're in, people paying attention to violence, but also communities and representations in a different way. I'm struck really by how much the visual has been an aid and a useful tool in getting people to pay attention, right? So a lot of the Black Lives Matter movement has been fueled by people having video cameras on their phones at all times and being able to document the predations of the police. A lot of the conversation around, especially Asian elders being attacked in the street, has come from people, including surveillance cameras and other individuals being able to capture those moments and really, highlighting the brutality of the attacks. And while we don't necessarily only want to focus on the depictions of violence, for our last question, I want to ask you folks how you envision the future of using visual media for solidarity across the communities that matter to us and in which we're embedded. And I wonder, what kind of opportunities do you see? Both of you are content creators, scholars, activists who have been doing this work for some time. What new kind of opportunities do you see in how visual media can help us see each other's humanity, as Ethan just said, insist on our own humanity and our own representations, and also seed opportunities for us to be in solidarity with each other and take actions that demonstrate our commitment to the humanity of all people?
We're currently going through a dark time, and I don't want to be hokey and say there's a light at the end of the tunnel, but I will say that we have the tools to fight the fight. And in terms of, in response to your question directly, I would say what's old is new again. A picture is worth 1,000 words. And I recently realized this by watching a movie that has nothing, probably has something to do with this, but it's called Queen and Slim. A movie about two Black folks that are running from the police. They go on, it's a chase movie, and then by the end, I mean, spoiler alert, like they don't make it, and a picture that they took in the middle of the movie is iconicized. So the last shot is of kids wearing their picture and murals being put up. And that made me realize the importance of pictures and the importance of iconography. So in the discussions with Black and Asian people, and in social media, as we're looking for ways that we have been aligned and there have been alliances, there are the constant reposting of very certain pictures. One picture is back during the Black Panther era when there was a man with a Black Power, Yellow Peril picture next to the Black Panthers holding guns, I think, or maybe pictures or something. But like in that picture, and these things are used over and over again. And it's always just maybe the same 5 pictures. So how are we doing this moving forward? We're creating this, this Facebook group, of course, but it's not, like I said at the beginning, it's not just a Facebook group. We're looking to do in-person things. And when we do in-person things, COVID-friendly, safe, pandemic, post-pandemic, vaccinated and everything, we look to document. We look to create new images, new media, so that, God forbid, 50 to 100 years in the future, if folks are still fighting, they'll have something a little more updated to say, hey, well, look, in 2021, they did this. So this is an example of when these two communities came together. So I believe now in 2075 that we can do it. I hope that they're not still fighting, that we're not still fighting at that point, but we've got to keep on providing examples that show, because again, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and video is very powerful. And I hope to leave a legacy that shows the work and that it makes change sooner rather than later.
I feel like we can end on that note. Dang, Johnathan. I'll just throw my piece into this, and just to echo what Johnathan said, I think the visual gives us a window to not only help share our stories, but to really control our narratives. And I think it becomes a multitude of things, and I think one of the things I always tell my students is we all choose different ways to engage. Not all of us are going to be at the front lines. Not all of us are going to be, making content to create and share, but we can use that creativity in a multitude of ways to not only analyze the past, but strategize for the now and for the future. And I think this gives us an opportunity whenever we're creating images, words, and text, and so much more. It gives people an opportunity to really listen to us, not just through the ears, but also to see us, to hear us, to try to understand us, to try to feel us. And in many ways, to feel what is going on, why and how that's resonating through different people in different ways, but even more so, why it's so important for us to use that as a point of connection and not necessarily just as a point to always disconnect us as well. I was going to say something more profound and it just is out of the mind at the moment.
Well, you've said many profound things, and I want to thank both of you, Ethan and Johnathan, for being in this conversation this afternoon. I think this is just part of this series, this ongoing engagement that we are a part of in our respective ways in the communities that we're a part of. I think we're learning from each other, and I think there's a lot more to learn. So I want to thank you both for sharing your thoughts this afternoon and sharing your work with our audience. And I want to wish you both well. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.